The night the illusion shattered began like any other, soft and ordinary, with Adrian walking Sofia home through narrow streets lit by fading lamps. The city was quieter than usual, a silence that clung like a warning, but they ignored it, too absorbed in the warmth of each other's company. He carried her laughter with him like a shield, not knowing that enemies had already set their plan in motion, watching, waiting for the moment to strike. Inside the Moretti Empire, a betrayal years in the making had finally sharpened into action. Antonio's closest lieutenant, a man named Vito, who had smiled at family dinners and sworn loyalty in countless oaths, had grown tired of living in another man's shadow. Greed burned hotter than allegiance, and with whispers to rival families he built a conspiracy that promised blood and power. But to destroy Antonio, he needed leverage strong enough to cut through the armor of a man feared by all. He needed the sun. And fate handed him not just Adrian, but Adrian's forbidden love, a weapon powerful enough to wound two enemies at once. They struck fast, shadows stepping from the alleyways, guns drawn, voices cold. Adrian fought, but fists and fury could not hold against steel and numbers. Sofia screamed, clawing at their captors, only to be silenced with rough hands. When the van's door slammed shut, the world tilted into chaos. By the time news reached Antonio Moretti, his rage was volcanic, shaking the walls of his mansion as his men scrambled for answers. Yet the betrayal cut deeper than rage could heal. His son had been taken not by police, not by a rival family alone, but by men he had trusted with his empire. The betrayal was internal, a cancer growing inside his walls. And when word reached Detective Javier Ramirez, it carried a cruel twist. His daughter had been kidnapped alongside the son of his greatest enemy. His first instinct was fury, confusion, and denial. How could Sofia be with Adrian Moretti? But beneath the questions rose a terror only a father could know, the primal fear of losing a child. When the two men finally stood face to face, it was not in a courtroom or at the scene of a raid but in a place stripped of pretense, a dark warehouse chosen for a desperate meeting. Antonio's glare burned with contempt, and Javier's eyes narrowed with decades of hatred, yet neither man raised a weapon. They had come for one reason only, to save their children. Your son brought her into this, Javier spat, but his voice cracked at the edges. And your enemies took them both, Antonio growled in reply. For the first time, the two adversaries stood on the same side of the line, not because they wished it, but because they had no choice. Their war could wait, the blood of their children could not. Adrian and Sofia, bound and bruised, found themselves in the heart of an abandoned factory far from the city's lights. Vito revealed himself not as the loyal soldier Adrian had grown up around, but as the traitor with V. After the night of fire and blood when Adrian and Sofia were finally pulled from the clutches of betrayal, the world did not simply return to what it had been. Survival brought relief, yes, but it also brought a new set of storms waiting to crash down. Both families carried the scars of that night, scars of bullets, of trust broken, of truths laid bare. For Adrian, stepping back into his father's mansion felt like stepping into a cage once more, but something had shifted. He was no longer a silent shadow hiding his art, no longer the frightened son afraid of Antonio Moretti's judgment. He had stood in the heart of chaos, had fought for Sofia's life and for his own, and in that fight his father had seen him not as weak but as a man. Yet recognition did not mean freedom. Antonio's empire still demanded an heir, still needed a figure to command fear and loyalty. Whispers of rebellion had been silenced with Vito's death, but the whispers of rival families beyond the city grew louder, emboldened by the scent of blood in the air. Adrian knew the peace was only temporary, a pause before the next war, and he found himself torn again between the role the world demanded of him and the love that gave him meaning. Sofia too faced a world reshaped by truth. Her father could no longer shield her from the darkness he had spent his career fighting, for she had walked directly into it. The revelation of her love for Adrian had been like a dagger to Javier Ramirez's heart, not because he doubted her courage or her judgment, but because it forced him to see the enemy as human, to see that the monster he hunted had a son who could feel, who could love, who could be worth something more than a target. Yet acceptance did not come easily. Every night Javier wrestled with anger and fear, torn between wanting to protect his daughter and wanting to sever her from the danger forever. And Sofia, strong-willed as she was, refused to be treated as a fragile piece of glass. She reminded him that she had faced death and chosen love, that her life could not be dictated by vendettas she never created. Their arguments were fierce, but beneath them lay a bond unshaken, for even in his rage, Javier knew she was his daughter, the same fire that had carried him through decades of war against the mob now burning in her veins. The city itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see whether the fragile truce between Antonio Moretti and Javier Ramirez would shatter or endure. For both men, it was an uneasy silence. They met only in necessity, exchanging words sharp as knives, yet behind those words was a reluctant acknowledgement they had saved each other's children, had fought side by side, had glimpsed for one fleeting night what it meant to stand not as enemies but as fathers. Still, history could not be erased. Blood spilled over decades lay heavy between them, and trust was a currency neither was willing to give freely. Rumors spread quickly in the underworld, painting their brief. The son of a mafia boss lived his life in shadows not of fear but of expectation, a weight pressing down on his shoulders heavier than any chain. Adrian Moretti had been born into power, wealth, and fear, yet his heart never belonged to that world of guns, deals, and silent threats. From the earliest days he remembered sneaking away from long dinners filled with cigar smoke and hushed conversations to sketch in hidden corners, pouring onto canvas a world he wished existed. His father, Antonio Moretti, the ruthless head of one of the most feared mafia families in the city, would never accept weakness, never tolerate softness, and in his eyes art was the softest pursuit of all. Adrian lived two lives, one as the heir expected to someday rule the Moretti empire and another as a secret dreamer who longed only for brushes, colors, and the freedom to paint without judgment. The conflict within him was a storm he endured alone, because to share it with anyone was to risk both disappointment and punishment. It was in this fragile balance of hiding who he was that fate played its cruelest and kindest trick. Sofia Ramirez entered his world not through the glittering halls of crime or the smoky clubs where his father's men gathered but in the most ordinary of ways. She was standing in front of a painting at a small gallery tucked away from the heart of the city, her dark hair spilling over her shoulders as she studied the strokes of an anonymous artist. That painting was his, one of the few he had dared to let out into the world under no name at all. Watching her linger in front of it, seeing the way her eyes softened, Adrian felt something he had never known before, a connection beyond words, the recognition of a soul that might understand his own. He stepped closer, drawn by an instinct he could not resist, and their conversation began as lightly as a breeze, yet beneath it an entire storm waited to unfold. What Adrian did not know, what he could not have imagined in that tender beginning, was that Sofia was not just any young woman drawn to his art. She was the daughter of Detective Javier Ramirez, the man who had built his career and sacrificed years of his life hunting Antonio Moretti. In every raid, every case file, every late night spent in his office filled with walls of photographs and maps, Detective Ramirez dreamed of the day he would finally tear the Moretti family down. And in his home, that obsession was no secret. Sofia had grown up hearing the name Moretti laced with venom, a name tied to bloodshed and corruption. Yet in that gallery she did not know the young man before her was bound to that hated name. She only knew he looked at the world with an artist's eyes, that he spoke of colors and shadows as if they mattered more than power or money, and that his presence stirred something in her heart she could not explain. Days turned to weeks, meetings grew longer, conversations deeper, and slowly the fragile bond between them transformed into